And it's recording. Let me formally welcome you then to the ACEN Research Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us, for making time on this Friday morning to come and talk to us about your research. The topic we're going to talk about today is around what do we do when we have limited resources and limited finance when it comes to our will research. And so the topic is doing will research on a shoestring. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm here in Dharawal country, and that is in Wollongong. And it was such a beautiful morning this morning. The sun was actually out after a few mornings of cloudiness, and I could see the sun rays shining on Mount Kira, and that's a fantastic thing. Mount Kira is our grandmother mountain, which is a mountain of education and of birth. So it was really nice to be able to see the sun shining on Grandmother Mountain. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from two researchers who've been at this will gig for a little while now, and you're very familiar with them. We're going to hear from Denise Jackson from Edith Cowan, and we're going to hear from Anna Rowe, who is from University of New South Wales. And we're also joined by Teresa Winchester-Sito, who is also from University of New South Wales. And we're excited to hear your pearls of wisdom today, Anna and Denise, and see if we can pocket any of those gems for our own will research. So I'll introduce you to them. So I've introduced you to them now, and we'll hear from them now. After that, there's probably enough of us to go into breakout rooms, and in those breakout rooms, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear about your research. We'd love to hear your challenges around resourcing in this particular space, and any other advice or guidance, or how you're going to pursue that research in the future. We'd love to hear about that too. All right, over to you, Anna and Denise. Who's kicking us off today?
That'll be me. Thanks, Bonnie. Hello to everyone from Perth. It's a bit chilly over here, and I see there's a few people from Perth that will be suffering the cold along with me as well. So a few things, I suppose, about conducting will in lean times or conducting will research. So I've done quite a lot of research without any funding, and still continue to do so. Actually, some of the research that I've done without funding has been with Anna, along with Jenny Fleming over in New Zealand. And so it is very much doable. And from that research, there's been, different outputs, and some of those have been publications. So it absolutely is possible. And we are seeing, I think, collectively across the country, a kind of a demise in available funding for obvious reasons. And I don't expect that will change anytime soon until we get more international students back into the country. So hopefully some of this info that I'll share with you, and I'm sure that Anna will share, might be useful. I think one of the key things for me is collaborating and being quite careful, I suppose, in your collaborations in terms of skill sets. So because the more diverse your collaboration and the more effective it is, the more you can get done as individuals, and then regroup and try to and obviously develop, have some rich data and some rich findings from that. So as you know, especially more the quant side, I tend to work more in the quantitative space. There is quite a focus on larger samples, especially if you want to publish in the higher ranked journals. And it depends on the study, but broadly using that rule, that it can be quite useful if you have incentives for surveys, but as we know, those incentives, it might be gift vouchers, etc., they cost money. And also using survey panel providers such as Qualtrics, etc., they can be very expensive, but they can save you a lot of time. But again, they'll need money. So if you're doing a quant study and you need a certain number of cases in terms of the analysis that you want to do, then really trying to generate a reasonably sized sample is important. So making sure that you're working with people that have good access to a sample. So, and it might be, for example, that you have collaborators that are obviously in different institutions, or not obviously, but ideally, or perhaps they are in different institutions, different regions might be appropriate, so you can get that good spread and representation. But also making sure that they have good access to students as well. I found in my own time when I was on the ground more and I was teaching and coordinating students more, I had better access, as it were, to students, whereas in the role that I'm in now, less so. So, you know, I guess thinking carefully and being honest with each other about the sample that you can attain, not just in numbers, but also in terms of the quality. And something that Teresa actually we spoke about before we started was about sampling techniques. So while for quant analysis, you know, having a larger sample is better, thinking carefully about the sample that you've got and the sample that you're after. So going through those different sampling techniques is important, and that's all, you know, part of your research design. But that, you know, that obviously, I think that's an important one. In terms, I mean, off the topic slightly, but in terms of collaboration and optimizing output and impact, sometimes international collaborations, you know, are quite highly regarded. I know in our own institution, when it comes to publishing, they look very favorably on international collaborations, although you do need to be a bit careful when you're publishing about the countries that you choose and whether there are different contexts there and how that impacts on your findings. That's frequently when I've submitted papers with, for example, Michael Tomlinson, who's based in the UK, and they've said, okay, what about the differences and the nuances around the UK and the Australian sample? So just, you know, I think very carefully about your research design before you and how to access a sample and the type of analysis you want to do and the sample that you need before you perhaps reach out to different collaborators. Something Anna will be talking more about the qual side, but something that I have encountered recently. We're running a project with no funding or very limited funding, and transcribing for interviews. As you probably know, professional transcriptions can be, you know, expensive, and transcribing manually yourself can be very expensive. So not only on Teams and Zoom can you record the audio and video, but there is facility, and I'm not familiar with this, there might be others that are more familiar, but you can also transcribe into a script, essentially, what's been said. And I've also been told that dictate through Word is also another one. So that's just something for you to check out and think about. In terms of, and I guess this goes back again to who you collaborate with, trying to take on the analysis yourself can really, you know, that really cuts down on research assistant costs. So I've pretty much done all my quant analysis on my own, or, you know, or that part of it, and then collaborate with others. They might do the qual side, for example, rather than using a research assistant. And that, you know, that can save you a lot of hours. So it depends on the RA you're using, but typically they're, you know, $50, $55 an hour, which can get very expensive. And if it's work that you can do yourself, then, you know, that's great. And often when we do run the analysis ourselves, we get to know, as I'm sure you know, the data, we get to know the data much better, especially with the qual side, I suppose. But you get to know your data set and the nuances around it and all the coding and the cleaning. I find that can be a really helpful, it's helpful to do that and do all that preliminary analysis yourself. And obviously it saves money as well. So I suppose be quite purposeful in terms of when you are collaborating with others, what is everyone's strengths and skill sets and preferences? What would they rather work on? What are they good at? So rather than you all being good at a particular thing, you know, try to have it so you've got a team or a partnership, or if there's just a couple of you that are, you know, are quite diverse. So for example, Anna, when I've worked with her, she's more focused on the qual side, you know, thematic analysis, etc. Whereas I would tend to do more of the quant side, and that you know, worked well when we did work together. Another point in terms of dissemination, obviously it's really important once you've done your work and your research and you've got your findings, to make sure that you get those out as much as possible. And, you know, traditionally this has been through conferences, which are obviously, you know, it's a struggle at the moment for face-to-face conferences. And the conference attendance can be extremely expensive as well. So, you know, not having money at the moment, at least, you know, you don't have to worry about the conference attendance, that chunk in your budget, or a budget that you don't have. And, you know, try to, I guess, take advantage of the virtual dissemination opportunities that there are. And you'll also find that there might be professional associations which are interested in your work and your findings, and could really help you and support the push out of your research and findings. It might be through, they might host a webinar for you, for example, and obviously invite members and promotion. And I'd say some professional associations are better than others on this. That's been my experience. And it really depends on what field and what discipline that you're working with. But making sure that you've got high impact. So it's not just the virtual conferences like the WASTE one and the ACEN one, but also, do think about those industry bodies and accrediting bodies or professional associations that might be interested in your work. If you are into the quant side, actually it could be qual as well. Another way of saving some money is looking at secondary data. As we know, gathering primary data can, that can accrue some costs in terms of incentives, and also can be, it takes time as well. So it might be that secondary data is an area that might be suitable for the work that you're doing. As you might know, I've used a graduate outcome survey, quite extensively for different things. And there are open comments in there as well. It's not all just, numbers and ratings. There's also the student experience survey and the employer satisfaction survey and other things as well. And just one last point, piggybacking off funding. So I had a situation recently where we had some funding from CPA Australia, and then they were running, and we're finding the research funding at ECU at the moment is quite focused on modelled around the linkage, for ARC linkage. So they're really trying to get us to collaborate with industry partners. And because I already had some funding and an agreement in place with CPA, I was able to use that partnership to apply for some internal funding. And then that boosted the budget that we've got, because the budget I got with CPA was quite small. So we got an additional, there was $3,000 available, just small grants. But, if there is any money internally, that can be great, just helping out on bits and bobs, with the research design that you've got developed and, in vision, as it were. That's it from me, and I'm happy to obviously answer questions on that later, but I'll pass over to Anna.
Thanks, Denise, and hi everyone. So some of the points that I'll make, they also apply both to qualitative research as well. So there might be a little bit of overlap, but yeah. So I guess one of the ways, and Denise touched on this earlier, is to one of the ways of saving money is to do your own interviews, say in qualitative research, your own interviews and analysis. This can save you time. Now, in qualitative research, sometimes the analysis can be quite time consuming depending on what kind of qualitative research you're doing. And so I guess when it comes to that, you need to sort of think about, well, how can I design the research, the interview questions so that they're clear, so they get the sort of data that, that will help you answer the research questions. But it can be a useful thing actually to do your own interviews with participants, because that can help you when it comes to the analysis phase. You're closer to the data. It'll also give you a better sense of when you're starting to reach data saturation, for example. So it can be a worthwhile thing doing. Also, as Denise mentioned earlier, finding people to collaborate with can also help. It could help share the load of undertaking the interviews, of transcribing them if you're doing that, and also analysing the data. Might also give you access to a wider pool of participants as well, if you have people particularly from different institutions or even different countries. Another thing to think about is perhaps instead of employing an RA to do your ethics application, to do that yourself. Admittedly, it may take up a bit of time, possibly a couple of days' work, but again, it will help save some money. In terms of the analysis of your qualitative data, in terms of, give some thought to what realistically you or your team can do with that in the time that you have available, because it can be quite time consuming. Think about your project design, your research design, and this is something that Denise touched on for quant analysis as well. You might be able to set it up in such a way that the data that you collect can be analysed fairly quickly with a basic kind of thematic analysis. It doesn't necessarily need to be anything too complicated. You might team up with someone else to help if you both need to code the data, for example. You can also use some automated forms of data analysis with particular types of software. Now, these aren't always necessarily quicker to use, because sometimes they do take up time to sort of set up the various different mechanisms to do the sort of analysis that you want, but sometimes they can help save time. And also in vivo, you can run some forms of analysis like word clouds and so forth that can be used that are automated, and you don't have to sort of code any data for those. Usually they're more useful as a kind of preliminary analysis to sort of see where there might be patterns, but Teresa and I have actually used those quite successfully and published some of those in our previous research, so might be worth thinking about. It's also worth looking at and asking about internal funding. Sometimes some of the projects that I've worked on, I think with Teresa, we had an idea and we just sort of asked, you know, like, is there any money available? And I mean, I guess the situation, as Denise said, is not quite the same these days. There isn't much additional money floating around, but sometimes it can be worth just asking if there's any money, just to get seed money, which could be used for a small pilot or exploratory study, just to get things going. And then you could then build on the findings of that to, you know, do a bigger study later on when there is some money available. Yeah, also just thinking about in terms of funding, if there's any sort of leftover money, sometimes towards the end of the financial year, there can be money floating around. So you can use that, for example, to buy transcription credit. Like, for example, I think Pacific Solutions, and I'm sure some of those other transcription companies allow you to buy like credit of, you know, $500, and then you can use it for up to 2 years, or usually something like that. So that can be worth thinking about if you have any leftover funds from research grants that you already have that you need to spend. You can use it for things like that. Also survey provider panel, survey panel providers, you can also use funding for those, gift vouchers. I know, for example, the research that Denise and I have done with Jenny Fleming on learning transfer, we didn't have any funding for that at all, except for like smaller bits of money that we got from institutions to help pay for like a prize, a small prize for some of the participants to go into who completed the survey. So, I mean, that's really the only funding that we had for that project. And, you know, we got some good outcomes from that. So, yeah, I think just going back to transcriptions, though, I think even though there's a lot of different services around, I think just also bearing in mind that you need to be careful of any ethical implications of, just for example, I was told once by someone that I think they were uploading their videos, or I can't remember whether it was videos or audio interviews into, I think it was YouTube or something like that, because it had some kind of automated transcription, but technically, because I think that technically makes it publicly available as far as I'm aware, so it probably wasn't the best way to approach it, because then I think you could get into trouble in terms of privacy and those sorts of things. Even if you didn't give the link to anyone, it's still a bit risky. So I think just bear in mind to be careful if you're using these sorts of mechanisms that automatically translate, that you're not inadvertently crossing any ethical boundaries. So, but yeah, that's all the points that I had for today. So thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you, Denise and Anna. I had not heard of getting credit for transcriptions, and that makes me really curious. So thank you for that tip. So we've heard about collaborating, drawing on your strengths, leveraging access to data, some tips around doing analysis and interviews yourself, some tips around transcription, and now I'd love to hear from all of you. We're going to go into 3 breakout rooms now with Teresa, Anna, and Denise being our group facilitators. So in those rooms, please turn your video on, share a little bit about yourself. So it's a good opportunity for us to get to know each other, others who are researching will and employability around Australia. So I'll open the rooms now, and you will see on your screen an invitation to join one of those rooms. Please feel free to go in there, and I'll see you in about 20 minutes.